So last weekend when we did our 3-day session, we took up a sutra by Hakuin Zenji, Song of Zazen. There are a couple of extra copies of it on top of the shoe rack if anybody wants to take one today. So because we talked about Hakuin Enchanted Song of Zazen last weekend, I thought I'd give you a koan today by Master Hakuin. Oh, also I forgot to mention there are a couple of books from our library on Hakuin that are on top of the shoe rack. If anybody wants to explore Hakuin a little further, you're welcome to sign those books out of the library. So here's the koan. Hakuin said to his students, "You know the sound of 2 hands clapping. Now tell me, what is the sound of 1 hand clapping?" So Hakuin gave his students a lot of advice about working with this koan. Some of it is very high-flown. I've chosen not to quote those parts. But I thought I'd read you some of what he said to his students. It gives you a sense of his personality. So here's what Hakuin says. 5 or 6 years ago, I made up my mind to instruct everyone by saying, listen to the sound of 1 hand. I have come to realize that this koan is infinitely more effective in instructing people than any of the methods I had used before. He doesn't mind praising his own work. He made this koan up. It seems to raise the ball of doubt in people much more easily, and the readiness with which progress in meditation is made has been as different as the clouds from the earth. Thus I had come to encourage the meditation on 1 hand exclusively. This is still a koan that many people get for their very first koan if they're doing koan work. The other one people get is mu. Does a dog have Buddha nature? Mu. What is the sound of 1 hand? When you clap together both hands, a sharp sound is heard. When you raise 1 hand, there is neither sound nor smell. It is something that can by no means be heard with the ear. If conceptions and discriminations are not mixed within it, and it is quite apart from seeing, hearing, perceiving, and knowing, and if while walking, standing, sitting, and reclining, you proceed straightforwardly without interruption in the study of this koan, then, at the time when reason is exhausted and words are ended, you will suddenly pluck out the karmic root of birth and death and break down the cave of ignorance. That's where all of us are, in a cave of ignorance. This is the natural state of mankind, personkind, humankind, until they're enlightened in the cave of ignorance. At this time, the basis of the mind, consciousness, and emotion is suddenly shattered. The realm of illusion, with its endless sinking in the cycle of birth and death, is overturned. When the sound of 1 hand enters the ear, to even the slightest degree, the sound of Buddha and all sounds existing in this world are heard without exception. When the sound of 1 hand enters the ear, even to the slightest degree, you penetrate the fact that eating gruel and rice, motion and action, do not lie in practice or study, but are the living samadhi with which all people are from the outset endowed. At this time, all is realized as empty-handed but holding a hoe, afoot yet riding a buffalo. This last line that he ends with is from Master Koan's poems that he affixed to the 10 ox herding picture. So one of the ox herding pictures, the ox herding pictures depict the stages of practice. And one poem he has affixed to these pictures is, empty-handed I hold a hoe, walking I ride a buffalo. Passing over a bridge, the bridge flows, but the water stands still. This is the last couple of lines. This is actually a koan that is in the koan rotation, at least where I studied. It's one of the first koans you get. The bridge flows, but the water stands still. How do you understand this? Okay, that's what Master Hakuin gave as a description for his students. It's astonishing when you stop to think about it, how many koans there are that have to do with hearing or sound. There's a famous, it was usual when people were enlightened to write an enlightenment poem after your enlightenment experience, just as it was usual for Zen people to write a death poem when they thought they were going to die. So there's a famous poem where the monk is sitting zazen and hears thunder, boom, and he's enlightened. Here's the poem. It says, "One stroke has made me forget all I knew. No artificial discipline is at all needed. In every movement, I uphold the ancient way." This is an enlightenment poem. There's a Xing Xing sound of the raindrops. It's raining, and he says to the student, "Do you hear the sound of the rain?" The student says, "Yes." He says, "Enter here." There's the hermit who roars. The pilgrimage monk meets a hermit in the mountains, and he says, what if you encountered a tiger here in the wild? Isn't it dangerous?" And the hermit roars, "Rawr!" There's Deshawn's shout. His colleague Yanto shows up. He stands in the doorway with one foot on one side and one foot on the other, and he says, "Is this ordinary or holy?" And Deshawn goes, "Yeah!" This is also a famous response of Rinzai. He yells at everybody or hits them. There's a very famous koan says, "Why put on the robe at the sound of the bell? This world is wide. Why would you bind yourself to this schedule?" This is for monks who hear the Han and go and sit. There's a famous koan of the monk who gave up and then went to become a gravekeeper, and sweeping the ground around the graves, he knocked a little rock into the bamboo. It went pop, and he went, "Aha, I get it." So there are lots of koans having to do with sound or sound and silence. There's a monk who encounters Fuketsu. And he says, both speech and silence are at fault. In other words, neither speaking nor remaining silent is it. So he says, how do we escape these faults? Fuketsu answers by quoting a poem. Not even his own poem, somebody else's poem. So lots of koans about sound and silence. Perhaps this is because hearing is like pre-verbal. We hear long before we can speak. And sound tends to penetrate where no words are. It communicates without words. In Hakuin's koan, we're asked about a special kind of sound, the sound of one hand. And the Koan points to a really basic problem that we're faced with if we want to discover our Buddha nature, if we want to wake up. And here's the problem. If the self is empty, as Buddhism tells us it is, if all things are empty, what are we to make of the phenomenal universe? It seems to be so very full. What are we to make of the feedback that we receive from our senses at all times, pretty much? The Heart Sutra says, Avalokiteshvara clearly saw emptiness of all the 5 conditions. The 5 conditions are the 5 senses. It says there is no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, no color, sound, smell, taste, phenomena. This is a sutra which we chant every Sunday. We'll chant it today when we get to the end of our program here. It's pretty clear in what it tells us. It plugs away at all possible forms we might cling to, and it negates them. No sensation, conception, discrimination, no awareness, no ignorance, no end to ignorance, no old age and death, and no end to old age and death. No suffering, no cause of suffering, no extinguishing, no path, no wisdom and no gain, no hindrance in the mind. No, 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 none, 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 empty, empty, empty. And yet, you know, another sutra which we chant in session, the Bodhisattva's vow, says this: when we look at the real form of the universe, all is the never-failing manifestation of the mysterious truth of the awakened life. So part of, you know, the truth about what this word manifestation of the mysterious truth, part of what it means is a materialization. In materialization, manifestation, something makes itself known. It takes on form and it becomes accessible to the senses. So what can we make of this divergence between the world as it appears to be from our senses and impressions and the world of emptiness described in so many Buddhist sources? So to answer Hakuin's koan of one hand involves reconciling these 2 ways of seeing the world. To find the answer to the sound of one hand, we have to come to some understanding of the word one. What does this word mean in this context? It means 2 different things depending on which world we're thinking about. The world of manifest, embodied form, where we have 2 sounds and there's hand. There's sound and there's 2 hands. Or if we are in the world of the Heart Sutra, where there is no sound, no manifestation, only 1 hand, not 2. To think of this problem in shorthand, we can just think of these 2 worlds as the relative and the absolute, which we talk about all the time. The world of 10,000 things and the world of emptiness. These 2 ways of looking at things are opposed to each other. The world of manifestation is easy for us to appreciate. It convinces us because we get data from our senses. The eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. In Western science, we say we have 5 senses, but in Buddhism, they often record 6. And the 6th sense is the mind. It makes sense in a way because we know that our senses communicate nothing if it doesn't communicate to our brain. So that every sense impression goes to the brain, and the brain is the part that tells us what it is. The brain interprets the data. So assuming that all our senses are working, we perceive forms and objects in the world as real. We give them names, we label them, we form opinions about them, we have feelings about them. We like chocolate, we hate castor oil. The ordinary everyday world of forms is the element we swim in. It's what we all come into Zen practice with. This is part of what we call delusion, is this world of the senses. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's that the way we interpret our experience from this is off. It's not correct. It's not all there is. This is a world that many people never question. Yet not everything fits into this picture of the world of forms, because sensory data is processed by the brain. The same data varies depending on whose brain it's processed by. I like classical music, you hate it. Same data. And any data that we receive is not even the same for us at all stages of our lives. We change so that our interpretation of sensory input changes. Even if we're focusing on a single thing, that form, is changing while we're focusing on it. So when we pay attention to our experience, we begin to see that the relative world of form and sense data that seems so real and concrete, it's not very stable and enduring. The relative world, which at first seems so fixed, is constantly changing, as are the minds that process the data. So this way of experiencing things is looking a little bit deeper than just receiving data and taking it as given. So this is what causes us to question, is this world of form that seems so simple and manifest, is it all there is? This is what the Buddha saw when he sat down and examined his experience. He saw this experience and he began to look at the implications of this experience. If this is actually what I'm experiencing, what does it mean? And he drew several conclusions. He said that if things are always changing, then from moment to moment, they're not the same thing. We may call it cushion, but it's not the same cushion from moment to moment. So he labeled this quality that things have of always changing, he labeled this impermanence. So he said if things are not solid, enduring objects, if they're not always the same, then really we have to say that they don't really exist in the way that we first thought they did. This impermanence of things means that the nature of all things is empty. This is the word that Buddhism has agreed to use to describe the basic nature of form. It is empty. What is it empty of? It's empty of permanence. Because it's always changing, it's not always the same. But we have to be careful, this is a Zen student thing, they like to jump on the bandwagon. You have to be careful not to misinterpret what emptiness means. Things are not empty of molecules, waves, atoms, mass, form. They have all those things. So in that sense, they do exist. The world is not a vast wasteland if you see it in the Buddhist way. There are forms, and they are real in their way. You can't walk through walls. They are there. They're empty, but they're there. It's not that your mind is real and your body isn't. This is another favorite conclusion that people jump to. Your mind is real and your body is real, and both are empty. But it's true that everything is always changing, and that makes everything empty of permanence. So once the Buddha had gotten this far in his examination of reality, of life as it is, he went one step further. He examined the implications of impermanence and emptiness. He had gotten that far about analyzing form. He saw that if everything without exception is subject to change and thus empty of permanence, then all things are identical in that all things are impermanent and empty. So as different as things may seem in their various forms, in their basic nature, they are identical. So, I mean, it's very logical, right? If Lisa's empty and I'm empty, then in that emptiness, we're the same. And yet, I'm not Lisa and she's not me. We're very different. So this is another way of saying all things are one. If all things are empty, then all things are the same. And we can say all things are one. That's another way of saying they're all the same. So the original question that we ask about this koan is, what does one mean? Specifically, what does it mean in the way it's used in Hakuin's koan? Is he referring to the world where things are manifest, embodied, where we have two hands and there's sound? In this world, one refers to a number. It points to a single item. It's a counter. Or is Hakuin referring to the world of oneness, where all things are subject to change and all things are empty? In this world, there is no sound, and there's only one hand. If he's referring to the latter world, then those two hands clapping are already one. They're the same, both empty. They were never separate to begin with. There was always just one hand, one whole. So what is the sound of one hand in this case? Remember that among the things that are changing, empty, and one is you. You're part of these things. You have the same identical nature as hands and sounds and everything else. So you could ask, is there anyone who hears? Our practice puts a lot of emphasis on silence. We sit in silence. And yet we're not trying to eliminate sounds from the world. Avalokita Shwara still hears the cries of the world. Very important. The silence we seek comes not from us. The silence we seek comes from us, not from the world. Silence is not the absence of sounds. Silence is the mind with which we receive these sounds. Silence is the mind with which we receive these sounds. Sometimes silence is the answer to a koan. There's a famous koan about Vimalakirti who gave a silent talk. There's the famous koan of Buddha and Mahakayasapa Buddha holds up a flower and doesn't say a word. That's his Dharma talk. Sometimes a great shout is the answer to a koan. So when do we have one hand and when do we have two? Maybe we don't really know the sound of two hands clapping either. Is it different from the sound of one hand? Is there any sound at all? Maybe sound and silence are more complicated than we first think. So what is the sound of one hand clapping? And where do you find the self in this?